my name is Afshin Marashi, and I'm the Farzana Family Chair in Modern Iranian History here at the University of Oklahoma. And on behalf of everyone at the Farzana Center and the University of Oklahoma, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the OU Iranian Studies podcast. This is another in our ongoing series of podcast interviews with visiting speakers at the OU Farzana Center and other scholars, like we're doing today via Zoom. Folks that are in the field of Iranian history, culture, politics, and society. We try to keep these interviews informal and friendly, try to spotlight new research in the field, and try to get to know the people that we're interviewing. Today, we are fortunate to have with us James Gustafson. James is professor of history at Indiana State University, where he teaches and writes on Iranian and Middle Eastern history, among many other things, I'm sure. So, James, welcome to the OU Iranian Studies podcast.
Thank you for having me. Always good to see you, Afshin. One of my
Well,
favorite.
good to see you. I was just going to say, James is one of my favorite people in the field of Iranian studies, but I don't get a chance to hang out with him enough or chat with him about anything. So it's always a good opportunity to chat with you. So I thought that would be a good reason to have a podcast, just so I can talk to you for about half an hour or so. So good. James has published widely on Iranian social history, economic history, regional histories, geography, and other things. His first book was on Kerman in the 19th century, which I think was published in 2015.
Yeah, 2015, 2016, somewhere in there. It's all a blur these days.
I think that's how I first became aware of you and your work. And I really enjoyed that book as well, and I learned a lot from it. He's also written on the carpet industry in 19th century Iran, which I just recommended to a student. They read, I think, your Encyclopedia Iranic article on this. You probably published on it elsewhere too, but I just recommended that to someone, which is another great topic. James has also just published a new book, a really significant book titled The Lion and the Sun, Environmental History and the Making of Modern Iran, published 2024 by Bloomsbury IB Tauris. And am I correct to say the paperback is out or almost out?
It's coming out in August, so hopefully just in time for fall courses.
Okay, very good. Well, I recommend it highly. It's a great work that synthesizes a lot of things that we haven't really thought about in the context of Iranian history and brings a lot of new information for us to think about. I really do want to talk about the book, but first I want to just kind of ask you about your academic background and how you developed an interest in Iranian history. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? How did you become interested in Iran of all things?
Yeah, sort of a string of strange circumstances, I guess. So I grew up in Vancouver, Washington, and I was going as a freshman. I went to Portland State University and decided after my freshman year that I wanted to have the kind of big college experience at an East Coast school somewhere that wasn't too hot. So I ended up in Massachusetts. And so I went to UMass starting on September 1st, 2001.
Oh,
And 10 days later, the whole world got turned upside down on
oh
me.
yes, yes.
So there was just a lot going on at that time. I was a political science student. There's a lot of just with things going on with the Bush administration, the Taliban in Afghanistan, beginnings of the kind of buildup of this vilification of Muslims in the Middle East. And I, it kind of drove me to learn and understand what I could as someone with really no background or anything really in the Middle East. Um, Also, I do not come from a wealthy family by any means. I was paying my way through, well, my rent anyway in college by working at a 1 hour photo booth, if that dates me at all.
When
But
you're still, yeah,
yeah,
photo mat.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And so it just so happened that in the evenings after my classes, I worked with a Zoroastrian immigrant from Iran,
Oh, that
uh,
explains.
this photo mat, and I was studying French. I just love learning languages, um, and she just started teaching me Persian out of just pure boredom, right? Just trying to pass the time, try not to look too much at what's coming through a college town's 1 hour photo booth as well. But it was a good distraction from that. But I became such just a lover of the language as soon as I got my first taste of it. UMass at that point did not teach Persian. Neither did any of like Amherst College or Mount Holyoke or any of the five colleges around. But I had friends in Boston that I used to go and visit on the weekends, and I found that there was a community language academy right near Boston University that taught Saturday afternoon language classes.
Okay.
And so I started just like driving out on the weekends, and it was mainly like, middle-aged people who were marrying into Iranian families trying to
Right.
impress their in-laws, and me, a 20-year-old college student, 21-year-old college student.
Well, that's good.
But after a couple of years of that, I ended up I got into University of Chicago's Center for Middle East Studies for a master's program and got to work with some really
Oh, yeah.
just fabulous scholars there and really work on my Persian full time for a couple of years and just never really looked back.
Well, that's great that you started the language early. Persian, you can make good progress with Persian, but it's still, the sooner you start, the better. And if you kind of discovered it on your own and made your way, you kind of could make progress by the time you're ready to do research at graduate school. It's interesting you made the transition from political science to history because I actually made the same transition. I was a freshman in 1987. And this is sort of the 80s era, Iran and Middle East, which had its own complications, as you probably know. Uh, but I remember taking political science classes, trying to figure out what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Iran. I mean, I was just so frustrated because it didn't seem like this is still kind of a period before maybe political science evolved to what it became later. But in those days, it seemed very kind of traditional. It didn't really help to explain anything that I was interested in very well. It was almost sort of a late era modernization theory. It was still kind of the dogma. And so I kind of became frustrated with political science, and that's why I went to history for graduate school for that reason. I think that's kind of a familiar story. A lot of people go into IR and political science, and then they sort of veer back into history and the humanities for a lot of people. So maybe we have that in common too. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, it just seems that context matters a lot, and
Yeah.
so that in within history, obviously, we have our own traditions of methodology and such, but we kind
Yeah.
of draw theory from a lot of places
Yeah. Right.
and complicate it by, I mean, hopefully, in at its best, it's a kind of reinforcing feedback loop where you
Yeah.
take theory and you put it in practice and you show where it works and where it doesn't and where the edges are, and then those case studies in turn help you build better theory to understand other case studies. So I always like that kind of looseness to history drawing from anywhere that's useful to answer your questions. In fact, when I started my PhD program at University of Washington, it was an interdisciplinary PhD program, and I kind of got poached into the history program. But my my interests were always very interdisciplinary and broad that way.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, for Iran in particular, we definitely need that kind of interdisciplinary approach. That's great. The other thing I admire about you is that you, like me, you're in Indiana, I'm in Oklahoma, and I think part of what I sort of see what I'm doing, and I think maybe for you too, is when we think about the field of Middle East studies, Iranian studies in particular, sort of few places that do that kind of thing, and a lot of them are either on the West Coast or the East Coast. But I think, part of the mission that I kind of have here, and I think maybe you sort of think about it that way in Indiana, is to sort of bring, the field of Iranian studies to the middle part of the country. And I think that's also something that all of us in the field should be thinking about, is thinking beyond the East Coast and the West Coast.
Yeah, bring some Mideast to the Midwest.
I, I say that as well to my students all the time. Well, let's talk about your book. You've defined the book as an environmental history of modern Iran. And as I was reading your book, what jumped out at me was how environmental history can really complicate and add some new interpretations to a lot of the histories that we kind of already think we know. And, in modern Iranian history, there's kind of an already pretty well established narrative that's based on political history, imperial history, or even religious history. And that's usually kind of the kind of explanations and the causation that the narratives are usually framed in. But your book really gives us a whole different set of things to consider. And it's this environmental geographic factor. Can you kind of maybe just define that for us? What does it mean to do environmental history of Iran?
Yeah, so I mean, environmental history, I think, scratches that itch of bringing in lots of new questions and seeking out answers wherever you can find them. So, broadly speaking, environmental history brings in environments to our narrative. So, it tries to understand how factors like non-human elements of our environment, geography, water, soils, right? How that influences the shape of human history in sometimes subtle ways, sometimes dramatic ones, but also in turn how people reshape those environments. So if we think about geography and environment as like a kind of context or something for human history, it's a context that we're always reshaping for our own needs. Um, so I mean, there's origins of this going back to like say Marshall Hodgson, who's like the great historian. Everyone has to read this in graduate school, the 3 volume, 1,200 page Venture of Islam. But um, that was really one of my first kind of introductions to this was in seminars at University of Chicago with
Well, of
John Hodgson.
course,
We
and that's
poured
where he
over
was.
everything.
So that tradition, you come out of the Hodgson tradition of Chicago.
Right, right. And so he had this kind of notion that there were some shared elements of social organization and political life and such that came out of this experience of the Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa, kind of inhabiting this mid-arid zone, as he called it. And just, I've always appreciated, I think, people having good questions, even more so than having good answers. So I always really liked Hodgson for the fact that he was asking some kind of new questions about how does geography and environment influence the shape of human history. And some of the early attempts at that were maybe off the mark a little bit or would stray into what we would call kind of environmental determinism today. So
Yeah.
my next school that I ended up at, in University of Washington, had Carl Wittfogel, who famously wrote this book about Oriental despotism and how
Oh
basically
yeah.
arid environments inevitably create authoritarian regimes because it takes a high level of organization to maintain irrigation works, and therefore you have to have really highly organized, stratified political systems to make that work, and it kind of scales up to authoritarianism, right? So environmental history is kind of sensitive to those kinds of approaches now of not maybe drawing such a straight line between just the chance organization of natural resources or geographical or environmental factors creating inevitable outcomes. But when you start really looking at questions or looking at periods and processes in human history with new questions in mind, you'll see that actually environments are kind of entangled with those issues pretty frequently.
I think you're right. That's definitely one of the things that jumps out for me in reading your book is that you've definitely avoided the environmental determinism, maybe temptation that maybe the field might gravitate towards, and you really have a good balance between those two things. It kind of reminds me of, I mean, the great tradition of interdisciplinary scholarship that kind of, never kind of becomes deterministic in that way. In some, I don't know, I'm thinking of maybe Anne Lampton might even be a kind of precursor to this kind of thing. Within our field, there maybe are some earlier people other than Hodgson within Iranian studies. Maybe I had some great conversations with Michael Bonine once about geography and his work in Iran. I just had a meeting with Michael Fisher, who also is a Chicago person. All these guys came out of Chicago, so you're
Yeah.
definitely part of that tradition. So I think there's a lot to take away from this book and this kind of approach, and I think that's something you've definitely demonstrated here. Even someone like I don't know if you know Ranin Kazemi. He's contemporary
Very well.
today. Yeah, he's at San Diego State, and he's, I think, doing some things that are not dissimilar. Sometimes it verges into economic history, but economic and environmental history might be also pretty closely connected with each other. I think we don't have enough economic history either in the field.
Oh, no, I completely agree. And I mean, I think there's people doing material history in one way or another are grappling with environmental issues. And so part of what this book was attempting to do was pull together a lot of those little threads that are out there. People
Right.
like Ranin Kazemi and um, um, Arash Khazeni, who's also in California working on all sorts of things related to tribalism and the turquoise trade and
Yeah,
fascinating
that's
stuff.
right.
Khatib Shafi'i, just lots of people doing fantastic work that maybe aren't thinking of themselves as environmental historians per se, but are doing things that are kind of within that broad umbrella. So there's a lot of commentary in that book on the work of this huge cohort, really, of people doing different forms of material history and trying to draw that together into a new sort of narrative
Mm-hmm.
of modern Iranian history.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, one of the things, the specific topics that you spend a lot of time discussing in the book is the fall of the Safavid Empire. And that's, I think, something you've really tried to kind of think about in a fresh way from this kind of environmental history approach. We usually have, the usual kind of political, personal explanations for the decline and fall of the Safavids. How do you explain the fall of the Safavids?
Well, yeah, so there was for a long time through the point where I was in graduate school as well, this modernization theory was still sort of dominant as a paradigm of that there was this sort of out competing of the Middle East by European societies that developed these great dynamic systems, and the Ottoman Empire fails to keep up, and Iran and Iranian studies are always kind of a little bit behind and follow
That's right.
whatever is happening within Ottoman studies. And so some of the explanations for what happens to the Safavid Empire um, follow some of those trends within modernization theory. So to be a little more specific, like the Safavid Empire was one of the great world powers in the early modern period. So they're around from 1501 until 1722. After, say, the Ming Dynasty in China and the Ottomans, they were, one of the most powerful states in the world with great commercial power and military power and such. Um, but by the time we get to, say, the French Revolution in the 19th century, Iran is a much more sort of weakened and divided state. Much of the 1700s, Iran is in a bit of turmoil, fragmented into local dynastic states and warfare and outmigration and really severe social crisis that takes place. But the explanations given for like what happened to the Safavid Empire kind of follow this trajectory of like Safavid decline that's always explained purely through human action by elites, and especially like in the early works that we always had to read in graduate school about the Safavids, it was always things like the Shahs drank too much. There's a very highly centralized
Right.
system, and once you have basically the people in the driver's seat taking their eyes off the road, they just drive the whole thing into the ditch,
That's right.
and it always felt a little
I
unsatisfying
think
to
it goes
me.
back to Chardin, the travel writing. I think he maybe described some of it that way, and historians just sort of picked up on that in the 20th century or whenever it was.
Right, right. And we tend to get our information on the past through a very small handful of perspectives, typically from elites in cities connected to institutions of power, from dominant ethnic groups and such. And so we often see things through this elite male urban lens that is focused on elite urban male things. So we have to really intervene into and ask questions of our sources in order to draw out a bigger picture. Um, a few years ago, I was developing a seminar on global environmental history here at Indiana State, and I was a little disturbed to find that there was almost nothing written on Iran within the field of environmental history, but there's also this really dynamic field of early modern environmental history looking at the impact of climate change. Because
Okay.
with, like in the from the late 13th century into the early 19th century, you have this prolonged period of global cooling that people call the Little Ice Age. So it's
Right.
a period where mean temperatures across the northern hemisphere declined by about 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, which might not seem like a lot, but with global warming today, it wasn't just that everything uniformly got a little bit cooler; it's that it created these erratic effects in the climates across the northern hemisphere, and um, this actually helps to solve some or answer some questions that social and economic historians have had for a long time about why there seemed to be this huge number of revolts and revolutions and uprisings among rural communities and pastoral communities all over Eurasia in the 17th century in particular, which happened to be the kind of peak decades of
Hmm.
the disruptions to climate from the Little Ice Age crisis. So I was kind of piecing this all together, and my simmering dissatisfaction with the way that Safavid history has been told, and then this bigger picture of like little ice age studies that have looked at how the impact of climate change was involved in things like the 30 Years' War in Europe in the 1640s that devolved into massacres of populations, of mass famine and disease epidemics. The Ming Dynasty in China falls at the same time in the 1640s in the midst of this. In Iran, as soon as you start looking for this stuff in our historical record, it's actually all over our sources, all over our documents. So I worked with a climate scientist actually here at Indiana State named Jim Spear, a dendrochronologist, and he worked on kind of helping build a climate chronology out of tree rings, kind of because tree rings are very sensitive to things like variations in temperature and precipitation. And he was able to draw out a sort of signal of tree ring growth, which is a good proxy for environmental conditions, especially around cooling and the types of things that impact agriculture. While I was scouring through Safavid era writings from travelers and court chronicles and such, and we found very clearly by the time you get to the 1660s and 1670s, there's pretty dramatic struggle going on with the natural environment within Safavid Iran. So the argument that I made in this article that I published with Jim Spear and then the kind of follow up in the book is that climate change had a dramatic impact on agriculture in the Safavid Empire. The Safavids depended upon grain, depended upon the energy produced by uh, farming communities as well as pastoralists all throughout the empire. And right at this transition point in world history where you have the rise of these um, national monarchies and commercial states in Northern Europe and the decline, whatever you want to call it, of the Ottoman and Safavid and Ming states, it's all wrapped up in this period of climate change. And it seems that some societies pulled out of that very well, and others had long-term consequences to that. So Sam White wrote a great book about the Ottomans that they survived the Little Ice Age crisis, obviously, but also saw massive population decline, never really recovered entirely the sort of dynamic system that the Ottomans had prior to that. And a lot of the same parallels in a much more severe form occur in Safavid Iran. And there's also this long aftermath to it because human agency and the way that people respond to it actually, in most cases, is the decisive factor. And after the Safavid Empire falls, you have this long period of tribal armies basically trying to resurrect empire, hoarding grain, um, making extraordinary demands on populations that were already struggling, building enormous armies like Nadir Shah's 300,000 plus man army that, of course, is drawing resources from communities in crisis. So the book sort of followed up on that story to kind of give a longer term picture of this struggle between imperial elites and the natural environment that actually involves more or less the entirety of the population and extends also into kind of non-human players and that of plants and animals and such.
Well, I mean, it's a perfect example of the sort of the blending of the human and the non-human, because the non-human, of course, is the environmental factors, but then there's the human factors of people doing what you're saying, basically managing the resources, consolidating the resources, trying if grain is so central to the story as it is for your story, whoever can kind of bring that together and distribute it in the right way. That's the human element that interacts with the non-human element. It kind of explains, maybe I think you discussed this in the book, so the rise of the Qajars too. I mean, there was a moment when the little ice age kind of maybe started to thaw out a little bit, and the Qajars managed to kind of recreate a balance between sort of the human and the non-human. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's what's useful about the early Qajar period from an environmental historian's perspective is we get the opportunity to see how empire is reconstituted after a
Yeah.
moment of crisis. So I used a bit of theory borrowed from STS, from Society and Technology Studies, but actor network theory in particular was useful.
Yeah.
Thinking about empire in practical terms of like what empires do and how they operate. And a big piece of this that we always miss when we talk about empires as just a network of people and political negotiation is that they operate around a flow of resources. They operate around the energy produced by farming communities and pastoral communities that are paid into granaries and treasuries and redistributed through various means. And so they're very, dependent upon a large number of non-human factors. Um, so those arrangements of what Bruno Latour and actor network theorists call an assemblage, right? That it's thinking about something like agriculture. We have to go beyond the farmer to also consider the influence of oxen performing labor, the biological needs of plants, of water, irrigation works, technologies. All of these human and non-human factors work together to accomplish the work of agriculture. And you can think of that kind of scaling it up to like empire actually depends upon not just a network of people floating out there in the ether, but connected to land, connected to um, animal labor, connected to the needs of plants, connected to water resources. So we can see those assemblages, I think, most clearly at points where they break down in, say, the late Safavid period and through the 18th century crises, but also again when they're reconstituted during the Qajar period.
Hmm. Well, I mean that I think that's another period where you can sort of see this back and forth between the environmental and the human element. But maybe we can talk about the later Qajar period, because seems like another area where obviously this is a very well developed part of the historiography of Iran. It's sort of the decades preceding the 1906 revolution and the sort of all the transformations of the 20th century. It's a very well developed historiography. And I think what you're bringing to that discussion is really a whole new interpretation. And we usually think of that period as a story of, Russian and British imperialism. We think of, efforts at reform and state building. We think of the economic effects of the global economy, those kinds of things, maybe some of which overlaps with the environmental factor. But if we were to look at that particular period more specifically through the framework that you're proposing, how does that help us to kind of rethink some of the political history of the second half of the 19th century? Maybe we can talk about some things like that.
Yeah, I think especially after thinking through like the impact of climate change and the influence of kind of, human responses and systems to shaping this crisis. I also was, conscious of the fact that we're constantly remaking our environments as part of this process.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it becomes qualitatively um, different by the late 19th century when there are these assertive efforts to remake infrastructures, to reshape connections between world regions and such. So we have
Yeah.
this period in the late 19th century where you have the beginnings of steamships and canal building enterprises, of
Exactly.
new yeah, of new communication infrastructure. Like Iran is one of the first countries in Asia to have a functioning telegraphic system through a telegraph concession in the 1860s. So it actually shrinks the world. It reshapes the relationship between Iran and its neighbors and Europe and the Americas, and it becomes really wrapped up in these global networks much more than before. But a lot of the way that these, say, commercial systems and imperial systems operate, they appear to have kind of uh, control over environments. Like they've simplified landscapes. They've been able to create these new corridors through time and corridors through space to simplify and shrink our world in some ways. But um, it's largely established on conditions out of our control. And I think that's what we see in the late 19th century, right at the same time that there's these attempts to reshape environments and impose human control over them. There's also these spate of incidents that really show how little control people really have in practical terms over their environments. So, I mean, in the 1860s and 1870s, you have a series of really severe famines that are driven in part by consecutive years of drought. There were not good systems in place for managing, say, mass casualty events or distributing resources through some system to manage a crisis of that scale. A lot of what we would call social services today that we expect of government were not run through government at that time. Largely, there was, charitable institutions running through endowed institutions that would manage charitable needs and things, but they weren't really set up for something like a widespread famine affecting millions of people. So there was this real gap in like what the needs of the populations were and what government could provide. So it has this impact of both like kind of undermining a lot of how empire operated, but also driving demands for new forms of governmentality, of new sort of demands of, say, the Qajars to um,
Yeah.
intervene into and improve conditions for people that were affected by, say, famine and disease epidemics and earthquakes. So there's a chapter in the book that deals with these things. But I mean, Iran had a series of like seven really devastating cholera epidemics that really drove these conversations about what people should expect from government and how little control and ability they had, right, to intervene into and shape the outcomes of natural disasters, right?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, it makes the Qajar state seem unusually weak, which we kind of already knew. But I think what you're suggesting is that it does show a kind of social, popular uh, crystallization of a sense of public or a social need that collectively people are demanding for this kind of social state structures that could help in these kinds of environmental conditions, whether it's in cases of famine or earthquakes, which is another. Of course, Iran is a very earthquake
Right.
prone place. Or epidemic disease. Obviously, integration into the world economy also brought with it viruses that begin to circulate, and the state's inability to sort of meet the demands of these kinds of things, it generates that there is a sense of a public that needs help. And in a sense, that's kind of the origins of 1906 and a kind of collective national idea. It's not just European ideas of enlightenment and constitutionalism, as important as those things are, but there's a kind of popular need for a kind of nation building project as well in some respects.
Yeah, what struck me too when going back and looking at a lot of the, say, 1890s and 1900s political literature, there's a huge boom in this stuff after, the arrival of telegraph lines and these sorts of things where you have this greater kind of dialogue taking place and greater awareness of things happening in the wider world as well. But how much of that literature is actually discussing very material things of like questions of how or who rather should benefit from the wealth produced by land and labor within Iran, right? And they start to really term
Yeah.
this as like Iranian land and Iranian labor and the wealth of the Iranian nation. So a lot of that early nationalist literature within modernist publications is not speaking about nationalism in the abstract as like a shared community so much as they were about very concrete material things about
Yeah.
patterns of trade and how through concessionary agreements and such, a lot of the wealth of Iran was flowing out of the country in the hands of industrialists in the West. So it was kind of eye-opening to me to go back and look at that material again with a fresh set of questions and a fresh set of eyes and ask some new things of them. And
Absolutely.
striking how material those conversations were about the nature of inequality and who should really benefit from Iran's land and labor.
Well, I mean, it's true. When we tell the story of the tobacco protest, 1890, 91, it's always a story of imperialism and, wealthy elites selling off resources to other wealthy international elites. But in your interpretation, it becomes a popular protest that demands sort of control of the environment, of the tobacco crop, the agricultural productivity of the population. That becomes a sense of ownership of the land in a popular sense. Is grows out of that. We usually think of national ownership of natural resources in Iran as being connected to the oil concessions and the Mossadegh politics of the 1950s, but really the tobacco protest is really the precursor to the oil nationalization movement as a kind of popular mobilization of a kind of national movement of sorts.
Absolutely. I think that, the Qajars get a bad name, obviously, for, selling out the country and giving these huge monopoly arrangements to foreign industrialists and such. But I think we also have to kind of put the whole thing in
Oh,
context of
of course.
growing inequalities that already were pretty severe by the time we get to the late 19th century. The Qajars were actually kind of late to the game of reform movements, so they had the benefit of watching the debacle in Egypt after the Suez Canal crisis, where they essentially lost control of not just their canal but also the entirety of their uh,
Yeah, independent.
finances and
Yes.
such, right?
Yeah.
The Ottoman Empire had attempted a series of reform movements that did little more than kind of invite in opposition movements and kind of undermine the stability of the empire. So the Qajars tried this whole other tack of like trying to develop industries on the cheap, and we're like seeking to kind of partner with foreign industrialists to
Right.
say develop the tobacco industry. Maybe they don't have the capital or the technology to develop a robust tobacco sector, but they do have this Talbot guy who's willing to pay you up front a bunch of money to take control of tobacco and promises to give you a cut of the proceeds. And at the end of the day, like with their telegraphic service, you have an industry in place. Like
Right.
that's the thinking. The consequences of it, of course, are that you're,
You're
essentially selling off a lot
yeah.
of the country's resources to foreign industrialists, and people aren't, people who own the land and work the land and are growing the tobacco and uh, are not going to willingly go along with these things. And in fact, it prompts these really difficult conversations about the nature of wealth, the nature of inequality, who should benefit from tobacco produced on someone's own plot of land, now being monopolized and controlled by a foreign firm that's already in a position of great economic strength and military strength relative to Iran.
Well, I guess that might be the other side of a kind of, neoliberal model of development is that it does provoke the kind of things that you're describing. I always try to play devil's advocate for the Reuter concession,
Mhm.
just for as an intellectual exercise. Well, you get a banking system. You don't own it, but you get a banking system, or even a railroad. 1870 is pretty good.
And Nasser
Otherwise,
Ali really needed a good vacation in Europe as well. He needed to,
well, yes,
you
I mean
got to
that's
finance
the
that
way the
somehow.
story is usually told. But you could have had a rail system in 1870 instead of 1930 or whenever it was. In any case, maybe we can talk about how all of this is relevant for thinking about the later periods of Iranian history. The book ends with the rise of Reza Shah, but even the later 20th century or even the present, I mean, maybe that's sort of where we can kind of try to end on the discussion of how your framework and the narrative which you've applied to the basically the Safavid and the Qajar period and for up until the early part of the 20th century, which you've really tightly woven it all together in a very compelling and um, suggestive way. How does this apply then to the later periods, do you think? How can we think about the 20th century or even the history of the present, if you will, within this framework?
So one of the underlying things I wanted to do with this book is push back a little bit against a, a form of historical writing that dominates our field right now that is purely focused on human agency. Um, we have this controversy within environmental history of like environmental determinism, of drawing too straight a line between environmental factors and outcomes. But really, the opposite of that is pretty much an unchallenged orthodoxy right now that human beings create unilaterally the kind of outcomes within human societies without reference to this wider field of environmental factors and non-human factors that also are entangled with that. Even, the rise of Reza Shah is a good example of this. There's been a dozen or so biographies of Reza Shah that have come out in the last 20 years. And reading that material, a lot of the controversy there is like over the character of Reza Shah, his education, how much the British were involved in bringing him to power and such. But
Right.
the whole background to the rise of Reza Shah is a really striking one. I mean, Iran was experiencing a combination of um, kind of state collapse that began really since the Constitutional Revolution. You have World War One bringing military occupation to the country, and on top of that, one of the worst famines of the 20th century occurs in Iran, right as the influenza pandemic kind of pushes that into a severe crisis where something like 2 million people died. And it was like it was a complete social breakdown.
Yeah.
So Reza Shah came in as a strong man with this promise of restoring order and solving these problems that we rarely grapple with the environmental background of that whole story. It's most of the biographies of Reza Shah don't mention it at all, which is really striking to me how much we've written out
That's
environment.
true.
So from that point forward, we have a much more assertive kind of state approach to modernization that very often has a kind of re-engineering the environment tinge to it. So I would say in the 20th century, what we, from the point where the book sort of ends with this, bookend of the rise of Reza Shah and the Little Ice Age crisis, from that point onward, that human intervention becomes much more pronounced.
I
And
see.
there's these attempts to create, more simplified, orderly landscapes, but
Yeah.
also more fragile ones. And we certainly see now by the time we get to the Islamic Revolution and the struggle going on right now to manage water resources, to manage drought, to manage climate change. I mean, these aren't new issues at all. These are things that have been going on for a long time, but have, I think, just become more pronounced as human interventions into the environment have become more dramatic. And of course, the Islamic Republic has been very consistent in blaming sanctions for environmental issues. Iran is, experiencing a horrendous water crisis. They've been talking about moving the capital out of Tehran down
Yeah.
to the Persian Gulf Coast. I mean, these are dramatic
Yeah.
challenges, right? Um, they tend to blame foreign powers. They blame sanctions, which certainly have put a lot of pressure on Iran's
Yeah.
environment and economy, and climate change, right? Which are both ways of saying that it's not really their fault or not kind of disowning responsibility. But it actually comes from a long history of human interventions into the environment and choices made about favoring a particular type of development over another, favoring one community over another. I could give specific examples, but it's, you know, environmental and climate issues always have a strong human factor. We see that throughout the world with climate change, that it's not such a simple story of just everything gets a little hotter and everyone sort of uniformly has the same sort of you know, experience with that, but there's an unequal distribution of harm felt by communities based on all sorts of forms of inequality that exist in the world today. And Iran is experiencing that maybe a little bit more dramatically than elsewhere in the world, but it's a familiar story.
Well, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. Definitely the water story, the agricultural management, and all of that is something that's really been discussed, and moving the capital out of Tehran because of the water crisis is something to really think about in terms of both the non-human and the human. I'm wondering how they would manage something like an earthquake. I've always said the only thing that'll bring down the Islamic Republic is probably going to be an earthquake rather than anything else. But and see how the state can manage that. But rather than foreign intervention or even well-meaning popular uprisings. But the earthquake will be the big test if and when that comes. Everybody in Tehran is always sort of on eggshells for all kinds of reasons. But one of the big eggshells is the big one. I, who grew up in Los Angeles, know that quite well. But I'm wondering, maybe we can try to finish off this discussion. And we obviously have a lot more that we can talk about. But I'll just encourage our listeners to get the book, which is soon to be available in paperback. We're recording this in April of 2026, and hopefully it'll be out by the paperback will be available by the summer. And I'm glad the book is receiving so much attention and such well-deserved praise, and hopefully it'll have a wide readership even beyond specialists like me, and hopefully it'll be assigned in classrooms. I'm certainly going to assign some of it in my modern Iran class. But thank you, James, for joining us today on the OU Iranian Studies podcast. I'm really glad we had a chance to talk to you and talk about the book.
Thank you. I mean, it's been very humbling to see the positive response to the book, and I did try to write this for a general audience. I think it's really important right now, especially with environmental challenges we see in the world today, that we really contemplate our relationship with our environments in the past. That, if we want to carve out a new future, chart a new future, we need to have a new sort of history to inform that. So I've tried to make a modest contribution to that in my own way, but it's really nice to speak with you, Afshin. Pleasure as always.
Okay. Well, thank you again, James, and thanks to all of our listeners as well. And until next time, I will say goodbye. Thank you so much.